Now, tonight, in this special report, I want to just briefly broaden out to some independent legal experts who are looking at the same evidence and see some of the same crimes and other ones.
They were very worried about obstruction. They knew it from the get-go.
Seditious conspiracy is now in play, and that's very, very serious. Inciting a riot is now in play, and that's very, very serious.
It criminalizes not just actively being part of the conspiracy, but someone who assists in the insurrection. And here, Donald Trump obviously assisted.
What you've got now is a setup for a real thorough grand jury investigation.
So take obstruction. That's about abusing power or basically trying to destroy or corrupt the vote certification. And we all saw that happen by force on the 6th. But what is bad news for the Trump White House is this can also be prosecuted even without having to prove causing violence. For example, corrupt actions or threatening force or attempting to do so can be a crime.
The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby Engel.
There's debate over that testimony, but no one is debating that Trump wanted to go to the Capitol. That is not even debated by the Secret Service. A former prosecutor sees evidence of intent for the crime here. Now, this testimony that we have from yesterday also reveals Trump knew the rioters were armed, and he wanted them admitted, and he encouraged them, knowing they were armed, to go march on the Capitol.
I overheard the president say something to the effect of, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in.
We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol because you'll never take back our country with weakness.
Now, if Trump said that innocently or ignorantly, then it could be harder to prove incitement. But the same former prosecutor I cited notes the galling encouragement of weapons by Trump before that speech you just heard and says it's now the smoking gun to prove intent to incite. Then there's being a traitor, sedition, a.k.a. seditious conspiracy. We know Attorney General Garland is a cautious and careful lawyer, a former judge. And we also know his Justice Department has already found sufficient evidence they think will prove sedition. And we know that because some insurrectionists have been indicted for it. Now, there are veteran prosecutors who see in this new testimony evidence that could link others to the sedition conspiracy. Take Justice Department veteran David Laufman, who sees the testimony showing foreknowledge of the impending violence to the president, but also adding the caution that whether Trump joined the conspiracy remains to be seen. So, as I go through each of these potential crimes with you, I will say the simplest way to summarize the conspiracy case is TBD. It is also the gravest case, but it is not where charges against White House aides or Trump would start. It's sort of where they might end if you had the worst possible evidence and DOJ decided to move forward. Then there's fraud. Specifically defrauding the U.S. Take elector fraud, where Hutchinson discusses some of the key dates where things were ramping up for a ploy or some kind of attack being cooked up on the certification of the electors on January 6th.
In the days before January 2nd, I was apprehensive about the 6th, but when hearing Rudy's take on January 6th and then Mark's response, that evening was the first moment that I remember feeling scared. Scared
on January 2nd, as she was closer than almost anyone to what everyone was cooking up. And this is the part I mentioned where things are more intricate. I just walked through a bunch of stuff where it's like, okay, did they cause the violence? Were they armed? Did they link with the Proud Boys or not? This stuff is intricate, but that's not necessarily good news for the people around Trump and Trump if they are charged for it. Because Jan 2nd is the day Trump calls the top elections official in Georgia. That's now under separate investigation in that state. It's also the time when no one knew in public, but we know now that January 2nd is the day when White House aide Peter Navarro, who has since been indicted, was trying to organize state legislators for a coup to overthrow the votes, which he called a sweep. And remember, so much more of this looks different now, which is bad for them because they were hiding it then. Why hide these calls and this sweep plan if it was so lawful? Well, you get the answer. Maybe it wasn't. And now I want to dig in with you to the intricacy. Here's what Trump's allies were saying on Bannon's War Room podcast again on January 2nd. This is across some different points over the hour program.
The vice president's got a lot of power, and that's very important to recognize.
The president of the Senate, the vice president of the United States, is hardwired in, and he's actually a decision maker. This is not ministerial. Are we to assume that this is going to be a climactic battle that's going to take place this week about the very question of the constitutionality of the Electoral Count Act of 1877?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on the courage and the spine of the individuals involved.
Vice President Mike Pence? I don't.
I'm just a state representative. You mean I get to choose the president? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am, you do.
This is damning evidence now lined up with what we know. And while there's a lot of talk about Trump and PR and in public, you have to understand, and investigators are going to look at this, the role of Bannon's War Room there. What is being circulated is not designed to go to the whole country. It's designed to basically stay in that echo chamber, and much of that didn't get a lot of coverage at the time, although, as you may know, if you watch this program, we endeavor to have everyone on who's willing to come on. We've had Mr. Varro on. But legally, they were conspiring in public, according to some readings of this case. Mr. Eastman, the coup plotter, Mr. Bannon, those two people that I just showed you talking to each other about what they wanted to do on the 6th to steal the election. Well, Mr. Bannon has since been indicted. Mr. Eastman just had his phone lawfully seized for evidence of a crime. And they were talking then not to the whole country, but trying to sort of launder and socialize these ideas socially through the right wing so that more Republicans might join them in this sneak attack on the 6th. Now then, I want you to listen to this, because there's a lot of privilege here, and I don't mean executive privilege. I mean the privilege of someone who thinks they can just crime in public. Listen to the divulgement of the specific plans for the 6th and lawmakers that are allegedly being rallied around this plan by none other than Giuliani.
If you look at people like Jim Jordan and Matt Gaetz, and gosh, I mean, they are as skilled as some of the finest trial lawyers. And Hawley's stepping forward, briefing them and their staffs, basically turning over the knowledge that we have to them. They'll decide what they want to use of it. But that's going pretty smoothly. We're going to have a session today. We have veterans of this kind of process. Andy Biggs, and I don't want to mention just a few, but Gates and Biggs and Jordan. I'm sorry we're missing Mark Meadows. I told him, can you go back and ask a couple of Doug Collins? I mean, they were some of the best.
January 2nd, the same day Hutchinson testifies, things congealed and she got scared. And Giuliani, in that absolute privilege, and maybe scaring those people, maybe that's why some of those members of Congress reportedly did request pardons for their actions. Pardons are for criminals, because Giuliani is name-checking the chief of staff who's been dug in this committee, those members of Congress, and tying it together to what I showed you earlier, Eastman and Bannon planning to disrupt or defraud the certification, to steal the vote. If you can prove that, you can prove a crime. And then you have the arrogance, which can explain so many mistakes in life, but certainly in this plot. Mr. Giuliani, a lawyer, a former prosecutor, just casually, almost blithely sharing it all because he still works for the incumbent president. Maybe he really thought they were going to pull off the coup, and maybe he really didn't think he'd ever get in trouble. It's reminiscent of the arrogance of another thug mentality, Rick Ross, who talks about walking in the courtroom, sipping on a beverage. I know the judge, so I got a lot of leverage. Well, that's a gangster mentality that you're above the law. Mr. Giuliani is not. His law license has since been suspended, and many of these people are under investigation. Now turn to Hutchinson saying Meadows wanted to go to the, quote, Giuliani war room where Bannon and all these people had been conspiring or planning or whatever you want to call it, sweeping. This was on Insurrection Eve on January 5th. Consider what I just played you, some of which doesn't get enough attention, although I'm sure the DOJ has it. Consider what they were planning for the 6th, and then Hutchinson detailing that on Insurrection Eve.
He mentioned a few more times going up to the Willard Hotel that evening and then eventually dropped the subject the night of the 5th and said that he would dial in instead.
Mr. Meadows, with everything we now know, on the eve of the insurrection, wanted to go be with those individuals, with the Bannons and the Eastmans at the Willard, to plot. That was so important to him, he wanted to go there physically. Maybe, if you're looking at evidence, he didn't want an open phone line that might somehow possibly create a record. Maybe he just wanted to be there in person because this was so important to him. But only Mr. Meadows knows that, and he's ducking testifying. And it's really striking. Trump's own lawyers admitting all the problems here. Giuliani and Eastman talked about substituting electors, but of course, this is elector fraud. It'd be like substituting fraudulent ballots, which is a crime. And they have this backward justification that involves them ultimately basically saying their elector fraud plan is illegal.
It would seem to me that the people who are setting forth these certifications they know are false are guilty of a crime. They're making a false statement to the United States government.
Yes, I was part of the process to make sure there were alternate electors.
5th, and executive privilege. 5th.
We can't count slates of electors that were illegally certified. If you or I were to submit a bank mortgage application to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac that had that kind of misrepresentation on it, we would be in prison.
I assert my Fifth Amendment right against being compelled to be a witness against myself. 5th.
I don't need to say much more about that when you see their own words.